Imagine living in a world where a woman's health was judged by whether or not she had received a man's seed. In the Middle Ages, doctors and priests alike claimed that semen wasn't just for making children, it was medicine. They believed it carried life-giving heat, that it balanced humours, and that without it women's bodies would literally rot from the inside. Sounds filthy, it was. And yet this cure was preached, practiced, and defended for centuries. So get comfortable, pull your blanket tight, because tonight we're diving into one of the dirtiest, most shocking corners of medieval medicine. The idea that women needed men's bodies inside them. Not for love, not even for lust, but for survival. To understand how bizarre this sounds, you have to step into the medieval mindset. For physicians trained on Aristotle and Galen, everything about the human body was explained through the humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Balance meant health, imbalance meant sickness. Men, they said, were naturally hotter, stronger, more perfectly formed. Women were colder, weaker, and incomplete, a kind of failed man. And this imbalance wasn't just philosophical, it was thought to be physical. Too much coldness meant the wound could stagnate, menstrual blood could clot, the body could sicken. The cure? A man's warmth, a man's seed. Medieval medical text insisted semen wasn't just reproductive fluid, it was distilled life force. Galen described it as the purest blood, refined and boiled down by heat, until only vitality remained. To waste it was dangerous. To withhold it from women was cruel. They framed semen as medicine in the most literal sense. Injecting it into women, through sex, was considered therapeutic. A woman's cold womb needed warming. Her weak body needed fortifying. Her melancholy needed soothing. In other words, sex wasn't just natural, it was prescribed. This prescription had consequences. Widows were described as frail, sickly, and vulnerable to hysteria because they no longer received this supposed medicine. Virgins past puberty were warned of worse. Doctors believed that without release, their wombs might wander, travelling up the body, choking the throat, driving them insane. In medieval casebooks, hysteria was almost always explained as a lack of sexual fulfillment. The cure was obvious. Get seed into her. If not through marriage, then by any means possible. And here's the dirty truth. This gave men an excuse for everything. Husbands claimed that forcing sex wasn't abuse, it was health care. Priests excused their own affairs with women in confessionals by claiming to heal them. Even midwives, pressured by male theory, sometimes suggested desperate women find lovers simply to restore balance. A woman's body was never hers. It was a patient, and the prescription was a man. For medieval society, this logic was airtight. Women's monthly cycles, they said, were proof of their instability. Menstruation was explained as the body purging excess blood, an inferior substitute for male ejaculation. If a woman didn't bleed regularly, she was in danger. If she bled too much, she was in danger. Only a man could balance her system with his vital, heating seed. And if she resisted, well, doctors and priests warned that abstinence could cause suffocation, madness, or even death. But it wasn't only about keeping women docile at home. This belief shaped law and culture. Canon law gave wives almost no right to refuse their husbands. The so-called marital debt required them to submit on demand, because refusal wasn't just sinful, it was unhealthy. Priests thundered from pulpits that denying sex endangered the soul and the body. Communities whispered that barren women were barren because they failed to take their medicine properly. And yet, the hypocrisy was staggering. Prostitutes were condemned as sinful, yet some physicians openly admitted They were healthier because they had constant access to semen. Widows were pitied for their frailty, but mocked when they sought younger lovers to restore their strength. Chaste women were praised as holy, yet secretly feared as ticking time bombs of hysteria. Virginity was worshipped and pathologized all at once. The filthiest irony? This was never really about medicine. It was about control. By turning semen into a cure, men made themselves indispensable. Women couldn't be trusted to manage their own health because their very survival supposedly depended on men. And the medical texts reinforced it endlessly, quoting Galen, Aristotle, Avicenna, and every authority they could find. When you read these dusty manuscripts today, you don't just see ignorance, you see the excuses that allowed centuries of exploitation to hide behind the mask of healing. Picture this: a young widow, grieving, tired, but suddenly accused of looking pale. The local physician shakes his head. Her humours are blocked, her womb is wandering, she needs a cure. And the cure is always the same: sex, seed, submission. The town nods along, because that's what the book said. That's what the priests preached. It wasn't lust, it was medicine. This is how deeply the idea ran. Semen wasn't just seen as a substance, it was seen as salvation. Without it, women were doomed to sickness. With it, they were balanced. And that made it not only acceptable, but necessary for men to demand their bodies, again and again, under the guise of healing. The truth? This wasn't medicine, it was madness. But in the filth and shadows of medieval life, it was accepted as fact, defended in texts, enforced in law, preached from pulpits, and practiced in bedrooms and brothels. And for countless women, it turned the most intimate act into a never-ending prescription they could never refuse. The idea that semen was medicine didn't just belong to the dusty pages of physicians' manuals. It seeped into the pulpit, the confessional, and the marital bed. Priests and doctors, cloaked in authority, used it as both shield and weapon, turning lust into treatment and coercion into cure. Medieval people lived in a world where the line between healer and predator could blur so completely that women themselves were told their resistance was the sickness and submission the only remedy. Marriage contracts bound women not only in law but in body. The Church's teaching on the marital debt was clear. Husbands and wives owed each other sex, but in practice it was husbands who collected and wives who paid. Refusal wasn't just painted as rebellion, it was whispered to be dangerous. A wife who denied her husband's advances could be accused of bringing illness upon herself. Priests warned in sermons that abstinence turned the womb sour, that without a man's seed to warm it, it might wander or suffocate. The wife's body was not her own. It was a patient permanently in treatment, with her husband cast as doctor and priest rolled into one. But the pulpit was only the surface. Inside confessionals, where whispers could never be repeated outside, the dangers grew darker. A woman troubled by melancholy, palpitations, or irregular bleeding could be told her womb was choking her. A priest, far from offering prayer alone, might hint at a more intimate remedy. Records from ecclesiastical courts reveal disturbing patterns. Nuns mysteriously pregnant, priests accused of comforting their female penitents too well, abbots caught in scandals that shook entire towns. And often the excuse given was chillingly similar. The woman had been in need of release. Her health demanded it. What looked like sin was reframed as cure. Physicians, meanwhile, wrapped the same lust in medical Latin. They wrote casebooks describing women as if they were machines that rusted without oil, flesh that rotted without fertilization. One text declared plainly that virgins who resisted sex too long could go mad. Another said widows were doomed to sickness unless they remarried quickly, because without a man's medicine, their blood would stagnate and their wombs would rot. These weren't whispered jokes or tavern tales. These were professional opinions, read and copied in universities, treated as unquestionable wisdom. And when doctors delivered such advice to desperate families, it carried the weight of science itself. For women trapped in these doctrines, the reality was suffocating. A widow in her 30s, grieving and thin, might complain of sleeplessness and pain. A physician could shake his head gravely and prescribe marriage, or at least union, as the cure. Her neighbours would nod along, convinced that her weakness wasn't from grief or poverty, but from lack of seed. A young nun fainting during prayer might be told by her confessor that the devil gripped her womb, and that only release could savour her. What kind of release? That depended on who held the power in the room, but the girl had no choice either way. The hypocrisy was staggering. Prostitutes condemned from every pulpit were also quietly acknowledged as healthier because they had constant access to what men called medicine. Holy virgins were praised as saints, while doctors muttered that too much abstinence made them dangerous to themselves, and others, even queens when barren, were accused of not having been sufficiently warmed. And in every version of the story, blame fell on the woman. If she was sick, it was because she resisted. If she was barren, it was because she didn't climax. If she was hysterical, it was because she lacked a man. The so-called cure always pointed in the same direction, back to submission. Behind the sermons and the diagnoses, you can hear the real motive. Lust was everywhere, but it needed a disguise. Calling semen a cure gave men that disguise. A priest could reach for a woman and claim to save her soul and body at once. A doctor could lecture about humours while prescribing his own presence. A husband could demand access nightly and say it wasn't for him, but for her. And society, hungry to keep order, believed them. This wasn't just ignorance, it was infrastructure. By elevating semen to the level of medicine, medieval Europe gave men unending justification for taking women's bodies whenever they wished. It was lust sanctified, appetite disguised as duty. Women could never truly say no, because no itself was painted as sickness. And in every dark corner of this system, from the marital bed to the confessional booth, the same refrain echoed: "Your health depends on me." By the late Middle Ages, the theory of semen as medicine had grown into something even stranger, even filthier. Doctors insisted it wasn't enough for a woman to merely receive a man's seed. For conception to work and for health to be restored, she had to climax. They believed a woman's orgasm wasn't just a pleasurable accident, but a necessary part of medicine. If she didn't release her own seed, the man's would rot inside her womb. If she failed to enjoy the act, her body would remain cold, unbalanced, and sick. So the medieval cure wasn't only about penetration, it demanded satisfaction. This belief flipped women's bodies into a paradox. On one hand, they were painted as fragile, incomplete, desperately needing men. On the other, doctors argued they carried their own seed and needed to eject it, like a man, in order to stay healthy. The female orgasm, in their eyes, wasn't about desire, it was about balance. And because they imagined semen and orgasm as medical necessities, women's pleasure became not their own right, but another burden, another duty. Casebooks describe husbands reporting their wives as barren, only to be told by physicians to ensure she is pleased. The advice was blunt. If she didn't climax, she would not conceive. So the doctor urged the husband to try harder, to change positions, to prolong the act until she shuddered. Some even prescribed stimulants, herbs, ointments, even mechanical tools carved from wood to help. It sounds like liberation, but it wasn't. Women weren't being granted pleasure for themselves. They were being ordered to enjoy it as if their health depended on it. Orgasm wasn't their freedom, it was their prescription. This led to absurd contradictions. The church thundered against lust, against passion, against women who enjoyed sex too much. Yet physicians demanded the opposite, that wives had to climax for their own good. A woman caught moaning with pleasure could be condemned as wanton, yet praised as fertile. A nun accused of resisting marriage might be branded sickly, yet a prostitute mocked for enjoying her trade was ironically considered healthier. Society twisted itself in knots, trying to square the circle. Women's pleasure was shameful, but also necessary. Their refusal was sinful, but their desire was dangerous. And lurking beneath was a far dirtier truth. This obsession with female orgasm gave men another excuse. If a wife didn't climax, they could blame her for being barren. If she did climax, they could claim her pleasure wasn't her own, but proof that the medicine worked. And if she resisted entirely, they could say she was killing herself with coldness and wandering wombs. No matter what she did, the doctrine turned against her. Imagine a young bride in a cold stone chamber, her wedding night nothing like the ballads promised. Her husband, coached by a physician, tells her she must relax, that she must respond, that her body must convulse in order to prove she is fertile. Her discomfort doesn't matter. Her consent doesn't matter. The outcome has been prescribed. And when she fails to conceive, the shame is hers because clearly she did not enjoy it enough. Even in monasteries and convents, the logic twisted itself into scandal. Confessors whispered to women that their lack of climax was a spiritual sickness. There are records of priests helping penitents find release under the cover of therapy. Midwives caught between superstition and necessity sometimes whispered of tricks to stimulate brides who feared their wombs would fail without release. In some cases, herbs were rubbed, oils applied, and mechanical devices brought into play. And yet, none of it belonged to the women themselves. Every moan, every tremor, every spasm were claimed as medicine, not pleasure. And this is what makes the medieval obsession so filthy. They pathologized intimacy. They turned the private, messy, human reality of sex into something that could be measured, judged, prescribed, and controlled. Women weren't simply wives or lovers. They were patients strapped to a treatment they could never escape. Their bodies became laboratories where men experimented, their orgasms reduced to medical data. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at the absurdity, but for women who lived it, the consequences were brutal. Their health, their fertility, their reputation, all tied to whether or not they could climax on command, under conditions they didn't choose, with partners they often didn't want. The medieval cure of the healing orgasm wasn't about liberation at all. It was another chain, another dirty lie dressed up as medicine, enforced by doctors, priests, and husbands alike. Widows and virgins stood at the very edge of this medieval medical nightmare. If wives were constantly reminded that their husband's seed was their medicine, then widows were treated as tragic patients in decline. Doctors wrote that without regular intercourse, widows' bodies dried up, their wombs collapsed in on themselves, and their blood turned sour. It was said that grief alone couldn't explain their weakness. No, the real sickness was absence. Absence of male seed, absence of warming release. the cure, a new husband, as quickly as possible. That made widowhood less a personal tragedy than a public medical crisis. A woman whose husband died wasn't simply left vulnerable to poverty or loneliness. She was painted as biologically unstable. Communities whispered about them. A widow was dangerous, her womb wandering without direction, her body turning bitter. If she cried at church, people shook their heads. It wasn't grief, but her womb suffocating her. If she fainted, it was a lack of seed. If she lashed out, it was hysteria, proof that she was withering inside. Some physicians even advised families to watch their widows carefully and not leave them alone too long. Virgins, on the other hand, were another paradox. The church praised them as saints, pure vessels of holiness, but medicine viewed them with suspicion. A virgin who avoided marriage too long risked collapse of her body, also doctors claimed. They warned that virgins could develop terrifying illnesses, suffocation of the womb, madness, convulsions, even death, all because their bodies were cold, lacking the fire that semen supposedly brought. Some manuals claimed that virginity itself was a medical imbalance, a refusal of nature's design. Imagine the position this created for young women. To stay unmarried meant risking sickness, but to marry meant surrendering their bodies forever. And for widows, the contradiction was crueler still. If they grieved too openly, they were accused of exaggerating their pain. If they withdrew from society, they were accused of killing themselves by withholding their wombs from medicine. If they remarried quickly, they were mocked as lustful. The trap was perfect. There was no way to win. Behind these medical claims was the same dirty logic: control. By convincing society that a woman's body literally withered without a man's seed, men tightened their grip on widows' inheritance and virgins' futures. Families pushed widows into hasty remarriages, often to men chosen for property, not love. Virgins were pressured into cloisters, where at least the church could manage their health. And if a woman resisted both options, she was branded hysterical, unstable, unnatural. There are accounts of widows in city courts trying to defend their independence, only to be accused of madness when they refuse suitors. There are stories of young women taken to physicians for fainting spells, told bluntly they needed a husband to cure them. Even nuns weren't safe. Some convent scandals revolved around priests explaining to cloistered women that their illnesses were caused by lack of intercourse. And when pregnancies appeared, the women, not the priests, bore the brunt of the shame. The most grotesque part of it all is how normalised it became. Ordinary people absorbed these ideas so deeply that they joked about them. A bawdy song might mock a widow as dry as dust without her man. A fabliau might poke fun at a virgin driven mad by her untouched womb. Laughter reinforced the doctrine, shaming women into compliance by turning their suffering into entertainment. So widows and virgins, two groups supposedly on opposite ends of society, were both trapped by the same filthy lie. Their bodies were never their own, always in need of treatment, always under suspicion. Whether praised as holy or mocked as hysterical, they were defined not by their choices, but by the absence of men inside them. And the cure was always the same: seed. If there was any place where the theory of semen as medicine revealed its dirtiest contradictions, it was inside the convent walls. Nunneries were supposed to be sanctuaries, quiet retreats from the filth of the outside world, fortresses of purity where women devoted their lives to God. But even behind thick stone walls, the medical and religious obsession with female health followed them. Doctors and priests insisted that women's bodies needed seed, even when those women had sworn vows of chastity. The tension between doctrine and desire created scandals so shocking that they survive in court records and whispered chronicles centuries later. Convent illnesses became a favourite subject for medieval physicians. Nuns who complained of fainting spells, convulsions, or what they called melancholia were diagnosed as victims of suffocating wombs. Their ailments weren't linked to diet or stress or isolation, but to abstinence. The lack of seed, doctors claimed, was making them sick. They wrote in clinical tones that too much chastity could cause madness, even death, if a woman resisted nature's demand for union. In practice, this meant every nun who fell ill carried the same hidden accusation. Her vow was not only spiritually dangerous, but physically suicidal. Priests, tasked with hearing confessions and tending to the spiritual health of cloistered women, often found themselves in positions of dangerous intimacy. Some abused this power outright. Court records from across Europe describe priests caught sneaking into convents at night, not merely to talk, but to treat. The justification, when pressed, was often disturbingly similar to that of doctors. The women were sick and needed release. One scandal in Germany described a priest who told nuns their visions of angels were actually symptoms of hysteria, and offered his medicine as the cure. When pregnancy surfaced, blame was laid on the devil or on the supposed weakness of women, but the doctrine of semen as medicine gave cover for the men involved. Even abbesses, women who held authority within convent walls, sometimes bent to this twisted logic. Some scandals reveal abbesses allowing male confessors too much access, perhaps even believing the idea that the health of their sisters depended on it. Others were accused of secretly arranging visits for their nuns, rationalising it as a way of preventing illness. These weren't isolated fantasies. They were rooted in the medical theories of the time, which declared over and over again that women's health could not survive without seed. The hypocrisy was staggering. The Church exalted virginity as the highest spiritual calling, yet its own clerics muttered that virgins were doomed to illness unless they were treated. Convents were painted as untouchable sanctuaries, yet the very walls concealed some of the most scandalous abuses. The contradiction was never resolved because society wanted both things at once: pure virgins for the glory of God, and women's bodies still bound to the endless need for male medicine. Imagine a young novice sent to the convent at 12 or 13, never knowing the touch of a man. By 18, she grows pale, restless, prone to fainting. Her sisters murmur that she's being tested by the devil. The physician, when called, shakes his head and declares that her womb is suffocating her. The priest visiting her in private tells her release is the only cure. She's trapped in a web of obedience, to her vows, to her abbess, to her confessor. And in every thread of that web lies the same message. Her body cannot survive without what she swore never to take. And so convents, instead of being places where women escaped the demands of men's bodies, often became stages where those demands reappeared in distorted, secretive form. Whispers of orgiastic rituals, priests fathering children in cloisters, and nuns mysteriously found with bellies swollen. These weren't simply lurid tales invented later. They were the inevitable outcome of a society that claimed women would wither without men. The dirtiest truth of all is that no woman could ever truly escape the doctrine. Widow, virgin, wife or nun, all were bound to the same grim equation. Without seed you would rot, without climax you would fail, and in every case the cure was never yours to choose. It belonged to men, wrapped in the authority of medicine and the blessing of the Church. For all the weight of priests' sermons and doctors' treatises, women did not always accept the filthy doctrine passively. In the shadows of villages and cities, in cramped cottages and smoky kitchens, midwives and wise women whispered other truths. They couldn't rewrite the medical books or challenge the pulpit, but they could bend the rules. Midwives became the guardians of quiet resistance, carrying secret remedies, spreading knowledge that contradicted official doctrine, and protecting women in ways men would never have allowed. Midwives knew that the idea of semen as medicine was a lie, or at least not the only truth. They saw daily what male physicians ignored: women sick from childbirth, not from abstinence; young girls fainting from hunger, not from cold wombs; widows weakened by grief, not lack of seed. They understood the rhythms of women's bodies because they lived among them, and when desperate families called them to tend a feverish daughter or a pale widow, they didn't prescribe marriage as the cure. They offered herbs, poultices, and whispered reassurances that illness did not always come from between a man's legs. This silent defiance carried risk. Male doctors sneered at midwives, accusing them of witchcraft, superstition, or incompetence. The church often painted them as dangerous, meddling women who dared to heal without permission. But ordinary women trusted them. In their hands, healing was not lust dressed as medicine, but care rooted in reality. A midwife might brew sage tea for cramps, or prepare a poultice of chamomile for fever. She might even counsel a widow that her fainting spells would pass with time, not remarriage. Such advice flew in the face of everything physicians preached, and yet it worked often enough to keep trust alive. The secrecy went further. Midwives also became keepers of hidden knowledge about contraception and abortion, practices officially condemned, but widely practiced in whispers. This knowledge was survival. Women who feared pregnancy, especially outside marriage, turned to midwives for potions of pennyroyal, tansy, or rue. These herbs were dangerous, sometimes deadly, but they offered an escape from the endless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. In the eyes of the church, such acts were sinful, but for women they were a form of agency, and in each small act of defiance the doctrine of semen as medicine cracked just a little. Stories survive of midwives accused of leading women astray. Trials mention wise women telling widows they could survive without remarriage, advising virgins to avoid forced unions, even mocking the physician's obsession with seed. One midwife, brought before an ecclesiastical court, was accused of laughing at a doctor who prescribed intercourse for a sick young girl. Her words, recorded bitterly by the clerk, were simple: "If she is sick, let her rest. If she is hungry, let her eat. No man's body will cure her belly." For this she was branded dangerous, but for the women she served, she was a lifeline. Resistance wasn't only medical, it was cultural. Women sang bawdy songs, mocking the idea that they needed men's seed. Folk tales spread about clever wives tricking doctors, or about widows who lived long, healthy lives without remarrying. In these stories, the doctrine was turned into a joke, an absurdity exposed for what it was. Laughter became a weapon, even if whispered only among women at the hearth. Still, the danger was real. Any woman who resisted too openly risked being accused of witchcraft, and the association was deliberate. By branding midwives and healers as witches, the church and doctors sought to stamp out rival knowledge. They wanted women to believe that only men could hold the cure. Yet even under threat of fire, midwives passed their secrets on, one generation to the next. Their survival proved that not all women accepted the filthy doctrine without question. Imagine a winter night in a small village. A widow lies pale and coughing, her family whispering about remarriage. But the midwife sitting at her side mixes a broth of garlic and honey, tucks her beneath blankets, and tells her softly, "You do not need a man to live. You need warmth, food, rest." The words are simple, but in that moment, they are rebellion. This underground current of resistance mattered. It meant that, even while official doctrine painted women as patients in need of seed, other voices reminded them of their humanity. It meant that in kitchens and cottages, women could still carve out spaces of truth, even if small, even if secret. And it meant that the grand lie that women's health depended entirely on men was never absolute. There were always cracks, and through those cracks, another story of survival shone. If the theory of semen as medicine lived in the hands of doctors and priests, it was the courts that gave it teeth. In medieval Europe, law and medicine were intertwined, especially when it came to women's bodies. The doctrine that women withered without seed wasn't just whispered in monasteries. It appeared in accusations, trials and sentences. A sick widow could be declared unfit to manage property. A virgin suffering fainting spells could be pushed into a forced marriage for her health. Even convent scandals sometimes dragged women before bishops' courts, where their supposed illnesses became evidence of sin. The strangest part is how many scandals survive in the dusty parchment of legal records. One from France in the 14th century describes a young woman accused of madness. Her defence, her physician, argued that her father's refusal to marry her off had endangered her life, claiming she was suffocated by the womb from lack of intercourse. The judge agreed and ordered her into marriage within 6 months. The ruling didn't just strip her choice, it weaponized the doctrine of medical necessity against her. Other trials reveal the opposite twist: women accused of lustful excess. If a widow remarried quickly, neighbours whispered that she'd been driven by her womb. If a nun fell pregnant, the defence might argue she was a victim of hysteria, her sickness too great to resist. In some cases, these explanations lightened punishments for men, while branding women as diseased. The courtroom became a place where semen as medicine was used to explain away sins, protect abusers, and shame victims. The punishments were often more social than physical. A widow who resisted remarriage might lose custody of her children on grounds of ill health. A virgin refusing suitors could be confined, her fainting and tears labelled hysteria until she consented. Some women were locked away in convents for their safety, which in reality meant their silence. And in the harshest cases, women labelled hysterical or possessed were exorcised, a violent ritual meant to purge demons, but in practice often a terrifying public shaming. Scandal reports also show how communities turned illness into entertainment. A record from Italy describes villagers dragging a fainting widow into the street, jeering that her womb was choking her. Another tells of a young bride whose trembling fits on her wedding night became the subject of bawdy ballads sung in taverns. The humiliation was part of the punishment, and the doctrine of semen as medicine made it possible. But beneath all this filth, resistance flickered. Some women found ways to manipulate the very system that trapped them. A widow who wanted to remarry for love might claim she was fainting from lack of seed, forcing her family to allow the union. A nun accused of scandal might argue that her illness was proof of holiness, a trial from God, not from her womb. These strategies rarely freed them entirely, but they carved out cracks in the wall of control. Imagine standing in a medieval courtroom, stone walls echoing with the mutter of townsfolk. At the centre, a pale young woman trembles, While men debate her body like it's property, the physician insists her womb is suffocating her. The priest nods solemnly. The judge raises his hand and declares her fate. She must marry, must surrender her body for healing. Her voice doesn't matter. Her silence is taken as consent, and the crowd laughs as if it were all a performance. This is how medicine, lust and law collided. Women's health was never their own. It was debated in courtrooms, decided by men in robes, justified by science that reeked of superstition. And when scandals broke, it was women's reputations, women's futures, and women's lives that were sacrificed to preserve the filthy lie that without men they would rot. If medieval medicine was built on faulty theories, superstition poured gasoline on the fire. The idea that women's bodies needed semen didn't stay confined to universities or doctors' manuals. It seeped into folklore, sermons, and everyday beliefs. And perhaps the strangest, dirtiest superstition of them all was the wandering womb. According to physicians and preachers, a womb left unsatisfied by seed could move inside the body, like a restless animal. The image is grotesque, but it was taken seriously. Imagine a woman fainting in church. The priest would mutter that her womb had risen to her chest, cutting off her breath. A widow who couldn't stop coughing might be told her womb had crawled up toward her throat. A young girl with stomach pains? Her womb was writhing, desperate for release. This wasn't fringe gossip. It was mainstream medicine, recorded in Latin treatises and preached in sermons to terrified audiences. The cure, of course, was always the same: seed. Doctors prescribed marriage to pin the womb down with regular intercourse. Priests nodded along, warning that women who resisted would suffer madness. Even midwives, pressured by the dominant doctrine, sometimes repeated the superstition aloud to quiet families. And when women begged for alternative cures, herbs, diets, prayers, men scoffed. Nothing, they insisted, could calm the wandering womb except the presence of semen. Superstition went further, wrapping health into magical rituals. Some households kept amulets said to contain the womb, often shaped like male genitals or engraved with obscene images. Others burned herbs with the belief that the smell would lure the womb back into place, as if it were a wild creature that could be tamed with bait. In some villages, widows were made to sit over steaming concoctions of herbs and animal fat, the vapours supposedly coaxing their wombs downward. And yet always behind the ritual lurked the same grim refrain: nothing replaced seed. It was a superstition that gave men license to meddle endlessly in women's lives. Fathers used it to justify forcing daughters into early marriages. Husbands cited it to demand obedience in bed. Priests deployed it to lecture widows about remarriage. And when women resisted, superstition painted them as unnatural. Witches, temptresses, even carriers of disease, the wandering womb became a weapon, its phantom movements blamed for every cough, fainting spell, or mood swing. The cruelest part, many women believed it. After generations of hearing the same warnings, whispered at hearths and thundered from pulpits, it became nearly impossible not to. Imagine the fear. You feel a pain in your chest, and you remember the stories of wombs crawling upward. You faint, and neighbours mutter, "It's your chastity killing you." You cannot prove them wrong because everyone around you, from doctors to priests, repeats the same superstition. The womb itself, invisible, mysterious, became the most powerful weapon against women's freedom. Superstition didn't only frighten, it shamed. Women's bodies were treated like these ticking time bombs, dangerous and unstable without men. A virgin wasn't praised for purity, but pitied as sick. A widow wasn't admired for endurance, but mocked as withering. And every illness, no matter the cause, was dragged back to the same filthy truth. The doctrine became so ingrained that even women who sought help outside marriage could be turned away. A doctor might literally refuse treatment until she agreed to wed. But resistance crept in here too. Some women mocked the superstition in songs and stories. Fabliaux, bawdy medieval tales, often ridiculed doctors who prescribed marriage for every ailment. In these tales, women tricked men, pretending illness to secure gifts, or mocking physicians who thought lust was medicine. Laughter turned the doctrine on its head, exposing it as ridiculous. Even so, the official line remained deadly serious. The wandering womb superstition shows just how far medieval society would go to trap women in dependence. It wasn't enough to control their inheritance or dictate their marriages. Even their bodies were reimagined as unstable creatures, needing constant correction from men. The womb wasn't just an organ. It was turned into a curse, a problem, a monster, and women were told the only leash strong enough to hold it was semen. If superstition painted women's wombs as restless monsters, priests often positioned themselves as the only ones who could calm them. The confessional, meant to be a sacred space for absolution and counsel, sometimes became a front line for abuse. Behind the wooden screens and whispered prayers, the doctrine that women needed seed for health was twisted into a justification for exploitation. Confession was supposed to heal the soul. But medieval records are riddled with accusations of priests prescribing cures for the body too. Women who confessed to feelings of melancholy, to fainting fits, or even to sinful thoughts were told their troubles were not just spiritual. Their sickness, the priests claimed, stemmed from chastity itself. And conveniently, the very man who delivered the diagnosis was ready to provide the cure. The stories are shocking. In France, chronicles describe a confessor accused of telling widows that resisting remarriage was not only dangerous to their souls, but to their health. When one woman resisted, he began visiting her at night, claiming her fainting spells demanded urgent treatment. In Germany, bishops' court documents reveal cases where priests impregnated multiple nuns under the guise of healing hysteria. When scandals broke, the women were shamed as weak, while the priests often escaped with light punishments, a reassignment, a few prayers, or at worst, exile to another parish. The confessional gave priests an unrivaled power over women's secrets. A young girl could be convinced that her body was betraying her, that visions or trembling were signs of her womb's suffocation. If a priest whispered that release was the cure, how could she argue? She'd been told all her life that her body was a fragile vessel, doomed without seed. He was God's representative, her only authority in matters of faith and medicine. The imbalance of power was staggering. These abuses didn't remain hidden forever. Satirical literature of the Middle Ages often mocked lustful priests, depicting them sneaking through convent walls or seducing widows under the guise of counsel. Fabliaux, the bawdy tales recited in marketplaces, ridiculed clergy who cured women with their bodies. But even as society laughed, the practice endured. The joke was funny because it was true, and because everyone knew someone who had whispered of such scandals. Even official church councils acknowledged the problem. Decrees warned against priests spending too much time with nuns, against confessors meeting women in private. Yet the warnings rarely stopped the practice. Instead, the same church that preached chastity continued to nurture a system where women were told Their health depended on men, even men sworn to celibacy. Imagine kneeling in a cold confessional, the scent of incense clinging to your hair. You confess your sins, perhaps anger, perhaps doubt, perhaps simply that you feel weak and ill. The priest leans close and tells you your womb is suffocating, that your body cries out for relief. He frames it as duty, as medicine, as salvation. You are young, isolated, powerless. Do you resist or do you believe? For countless women, resistance was impossible. The dirtiest truth is that this wasn't rare. It was systemic. The doctrine of semen as medicine allowed priests to justify their desires and silence their victims. And in the end, it wasn't just women's bodies that were controlled. It was their very sense of truth, their ability to trust their own pain, their own instincts. Everything they were told about themselves was filtered through men. Men in robes, men with power, men who claimed God himself demanded their obedience. The confessional should have been a sanctuary. Instead, for many, it was a trap. And each whispered scandal, each hushed-up pregnancy, each ruined reputation proves how easily the lines between faith and filth blurred when medicine, superstition, and power collided. If doctors framed semen as medicine, and priests used it to justify their power, marriage was the institution that bound the whole dirty system together. It wasn't just about faith or superstition, it was about economics. The doctrine that women needed seed to survive gave fathers, husbands, and the church a powerful weapon to push women into unions that preserved property, controlled wealth, and reinforced male dominance. In the medieval imagination, a woman alone was unstable, physically, morally, even financially. The belief that widows withered without men wasn't just a medical warning. It was a convenient excuse for families eager to marry daughters into alliances or to secure dowries. Property law and medical superstition fed each other in a closed loop. A sick woman was an expense. A married woman was a transaction. And so medicine became economics, disguised as biology. Dowries made the connection painfully clear. A family might argue that a daughter's fainting spells or menstrual irregularities proved her womb was suffocating. The cure? Marriage, and the dowry attached to her. It was not just her health that was negotiated, but her body itself, priced and packaged. Men who married such women weren't portrayed as exploiters, but as healers, bringing balance to a failing body. The exchange of wealth masked the exchange of power. For widows, the pressure was even worse. Property often reverted to the husband's family unless the widow remarried. Doctors and priests joined forces to insist remarriage was necessary for health, while families insisted it was necessary for inheritance. The woman's voice was drowned out beneath layers of superstition and law. Refuse, and she risked being labelled hysterical, accused of witchcraft, or locked away. Accept, and her body and wealth pass once again into male control. Scandals reveal just how grotesque these transactions could become. In one English case, a widow in her 30s was declared unfit to govern herself after resisting remarriage for 3 years. The evidence, physicians testified that her constant fainting was caused by lack of seed. The court promptly married her off to her late husband's cousin, securing the estate for the family line. Her supposed illness, likely grief and stress, was weaponized to strip her of freedom. Even convents weren't safe from this economic reasoning. Nuns were accused of sickness when they resisted marriage before taking vows. Families argued that cloistering daughters endangered their health unless a large dowry was paid to compensate for her abstinence. In some cases, priests declared that virgins who entered convents without family approval would suffer suffocation of the womb. a threat designed to steer girls back into economically useful unions. What makes this filth so hard to stomach is how normalised it was. Villagers repeated the doctrine casually. A girl who looked pale clearly needed a husband. A widow, coughing in the marketplace, needed remarriage. Gossip reinforced the pressure until superstition, law, and economics blurred into a single suffocating net. And women themselves, trapped in the middle, often internalised it. Diaries and letters from noblewomen show them blaming fainting spells on their widowhood, or asking confessors if their bodies were rotting from lack of seed, but as always, resistance flickered. Folk tales mocked greedy families who forced daughters into healing marriages. Songs sung by washerwomen teased men who thought they were medicine, turning the doctrine into bawdy humour. Some widows fought legal battles to retain control of their estates, arguing that illness did not equal incompetence. These acts didn't dismantle the system, but they exposed its absurdity. Imagine a medieval wedding night. The bride, barely more than a girl, trembles in the marriage bed. Around her, neighbours murmur blessings, congratulating her family on securing her health. Her husband boasts of his role as healer. No one sees the truth, that her tears, her silence and her fear are ignored because superstition and economics have declared her body public property. Her womb is no longer hers. It belongs to medicine, to marriage, to men. This is the filthiest truth of all. The doctrine of semen as medicine was never just about belief. It was a tool sharpened into law, wielded in bedrooms and courtrooms alike. It reduced women's health to a bargaining chip, their bodies to vessels, their lives to transactions. And with every marriage arranged, every widow forced, every property secured, the lie grew stronger. By the late Middle Ages, the doctrine that semen was medicine had seeped so deep into culture that it began appearing in printed and handwritten manuals, guides written for physicians, priests, and even ordinary husbands. These texts didn't just describe women's bodies, they instructed men how to heal them, framing intercourse as treatment, obedience as cure, and submission as natural law. One of the most infamous works was the Trotula, a medical compendium from Salerno written in the 12th century. It contained advice for treating women's illnesses, some practical, some outrageous. Among its dirtiest prescriptions was the suggestion that women suffering from suffocation of the womb or menstrual stoppages should engage in intercourse. It was written matter-of-factly, like suggesting herbs for indigestion, a widow coughing blood, marriage, a virgin fainting, intercourse, a wife too melancholic, more seed from her husband. Other manuals were even more explicit. Handbooks circulated to priests included instructions for counselling women in confession. They warned that if women resisted intercourse, their wombs might wander, bringing madness or death. Some went further, advising confessors to encourage marriage at all costs. The spiritual became medical, the medical became marital, and the marital became a trap. Husbands, too, were taught to see themselves as doctors. In late medieval Europe, men were told it was their duty not just to provide seed for children, but to balance their wives' humours with regular intercourse. A man who neglected his wife could be accused of endangering her health. Yet this duty was not for her benefit, but for his authority. She was the patient, he was the cure. The bedroom became a clinic where her silence was assumed to be compliance. The manuals reveal grotesque contradictions. On one page, authors condemned women for lust, warning of the dangers of uncontrolled desire. On the next, they claimed women would sicken without men's seed. So women were trapped in a paradox. either too lustful or too sick from chastity. In both cases, men positioned themselves as the solution. One particularly filthy detail comes from a German text that described how to diagnose hysteria. Physicians were told to place scented herbs near a woman's mouth while applying foul odours below her waist. If she convulsed, the womb was said to be wandering. The cure: immediate marriage, or failing that, intercourse as soon as possible. Imagine the humiliation, a woman trembling in a room of men, her body tested like livestock, her dignity discarded. Even more disturbing were the instructions about widows and nuns. Manuals warned that women who went too long without seed might develop corruption of the blood. Their skin would pale, their voices weaken, their humours turn rancid. In some cases, authors hinted at remedies behind cloister walls, priests or confessors who might provide secret cures. The suggestion was barely veiled, a quiet acknowledgement that doctrine created the very scandals it claimed to prevent. But manuals weren't only medical, they were moral propaganda. They taught men that controlling women's bodies was righteous, even necessary. They wrapped dominance in the language of healing, making exploitation seem like charity. And women who resisted, who refused to marry, who preferred celibacy, who questioned the cures, were painted as sick, dangerous, or unnatural. Imagine finding one of these manuals in a monastery library. A young scribe copies the lines by candlelight. The womb is soothed by union. Without seed, women decay. He doesn't question it. To him, it's knowledge, confirmed by priests, reinforced by gossip. And outside, in the village below, women are living out the consequences: forced marriages, confessional exploitation, humiliating diagnoses. The manual is not a book of science. It is a handbook for control. This was how superstition became system. Not just whispered between neighbours, not just shouted from pulpits, but inked into pages, preserved in libraries, passed to generations. Each word repeated the filthy lie that women's health was never their own, that their survival depended on men. The doctrine that semen could heal women was never just a medical mistake, it was a poison, one that seeped into every corner of medieval life. It infected marriage, warped religion, justified exploitation, and turned women's own bodies into prisons. For centuries, the idea gave men license to claim not only women's time, wealth, and obedience, but their very health. It was control disguised as care, dominance framed as duty. Looking back, the sheer audacity of it is shocking. Learned men in robes scribbling in Latin argued that without a man's seed, women would rot. Priests stood in pulpits declaring that chastity was a disease. Fathers traded their daughters like medicine chests, warning that their pale cheeks meant only one thing. And through it all, women were silenced, their pain reframed, their resistance ignored. But history's filthiest truths are often the most revealing. They show us how deeply power can twist science, how superstition can dress itself in reason, and how authority can use fear to keep entire groups trapped. The wandering womb was never real. The suffocating virgin, the rotting widow, the hysterical nun. These were not patients, they were prisoners of a story told by men. And yet in the cracks of that story, we see resistance, laughter in the fabliaux that mocked lustful priests, songs sung by washerwomen ridiculing doctors who prescribed marriage as cure, widows who fought court battles, refusing to be remarried against their will. These small acts of defiance remind us that even in the filthiest systems, there were sparks of rebellion. Women were not merely victims, they were survivors, fighters, sometimes even mockers of the absurd truths imposed on them. Imagine one last scene. A medieval physician, quill in hand, writes that semen is life, that women are empty vessels needing to be filled. Centuries later, we read his words with horror, but perhaps that horror is useful. It reminds us how fragile truth is, how easily medicine can become ideology, how quickly science can be bent to justify power. And it reminds us too how necessary it is to listen, truly listen, to the voices that systems try to silence. Because for all the men who wrote manuals, who preached sermons, who sat in confessionals, there were women whose voices barely survive in scraps of letters, in whispered jokes, in fragments of song. Their silence is the dirtiest legacy of all, but their endurance, their survival despite everything, is the real medicine, one that outlived the filth, the lies, and the centuries of control. So next time someone calls the Middle Ages an age of ignorance, remember this. Ignorance was not the absence of knowledge, it was knowledge twisted into a weapon, and the story of semen as cure is one of the darkest proofs of how dangerous that weapon could be,